Good evening. On behalf of the Reparations Committee of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second in a series of 5 panels designed to help our committee and our diocese explore the pathways to reparations. My name is Diane Pollard, and since 2005, I have been working on this topic as a member of the Reparations Committee. Our work as a committee has confirmed and enforced our understanding that the original sin of slavery has for over 400 years shaped where we are today as a nation and world. This evening's panel focuses on systemic racism and medical apartheid. Our panelist and moderator will lead us in the exploration of exactly how this process has infected our society and our thinking. We are blessed to have 2 individuals who are experts in the field of medicine and in the systems that foster the disproportionate delivery of medical care to African Americans. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Nell Braxton Gibson, who will be introducing our panel to you.
Good evening. I'm Nell Braxton Gibson, the moderator for the evening, and I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for tonight. Mrs. Holly Argent Tariq is the Chief Executive Officer at St. Mary's Aid Center here in New York City. She has also served as a Leading Age National Fellow and board member of Continuing Care Leadership. Dr. Teresa Mack is Medical Director of the Mount Sinai Doctor Faculty Practice and Assistant Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at the Icahn School of Medicine here in New York City. We welcome them both to this evening's discussion on systemic racism and medical apartheid. It has been said that when we speak of reparations for slavery, one of the most needed areas of repair is the area of equal access to health services. This evening, our panelists will present a view of how the system of slavery led to many of the medical ills African Americans experience today. Their analysis will help the Reparations Committee of the Diocese consider what the repair from medical atrocities looks like. To begin the discussion, I will ask Mrs. Holly Argent Tariq if you would share how systemic racism and medical apartheid moved from the kidnapping of Africans through the Middle Passage, the auction block, and plantation life, culminating in many of the medical ills that exist in the African American community today.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate it and hope that together we'll be able to share some insight. I do want to say that prior to the slave trade, Africa had wealthy and powerful kingdoms. It was not a continent of slaves. Portuguese and Spanish began the European slave trade. And in the 16th century, the British became involved. Between 1532 and 1832, at least 12 million African people were taken from the continent, headed towards the Americas. The triangular trade route went from ports in Europe to West Africa, where people were traded for guns, brandy, and textiles. The people were taken from West and Central Africa and marched to coastal prisons called barracoons. There's no count of how many died en route. The barracoons were dark and dank and designed not only to hold the prisoners, but to disorient them. They remained there until the ships from Europe arrived. When the ships finally arrived, the people were packed, either loose or tight. If it was a loose pack, fewer people were on the ship. If it was a tight pack, more people were packed and fewer survived. However, a tight pack was the most profitable. Many of the prisoners on the ships jumped overboard rather than endure the barbarous conditions and treatment. Many simply died. Captain's logs state that sharks followed the ships due to the tremendous amount of food that was coming overboard from the ships. No one knows how many died crossing the Middle Passage. The voyage lasted from 3 weeks to several months, depending on the weather. Upon arrival in the New World, they were prepared for market. Their bodies had to heal from the sores from malnutrition and the beatings they endured on the travel here. Their skin was greased to look better. And then they were placed naked on an auction block and inspected like all the other livestock for sale. Some were trained or seasoned prior to sale in order to break them. This included forced feeding, sexual, physical assault, and other violence against their bodies and minds.
Thank you, Mrs. Argent Tariq, for that deep dive into history, which helps us better understand the journey we are on with regard to medical issues. Dr. Mack, the term epigenetics has been used a good deal lately in medical and psychoanalytic fields to describe some of the ailments African Americans have experienced over the centuries and continue to experience today. Would you help us understand how epigenetics may be unfolding in our lives?
Yes, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I want to first, before I talk about epigenetics, I just want to talk about genetics first. And genetics makes up our DNA. And that's everyone has a different DNA, but our DNA produces RNA, and the RNA produces protein. And proteins are how different cells in our body carry out their function. Kidney cells and brain cells have the same DNA, but they have different functions because of the way certain genes, the DNA, are turned on and off to create different proteins. And this doesn't change the genetic makeup. These are permanent changes, however. A kidney cell cannot turn into a brain cell at any time. Getting into epigenetics, this is the study of non-genetic influences like chronic stress that can switch our gene on and off without changing the genetic makeup. Epigenetic changes, though, are reversible as opposed to the kidney and the muscle cell. But chronic stress, social economic deprivation, racism, and traumatic experiences of African American ancestors may play a role in how patterns of our genes are turned on and are turned off. And that is the study of epigenetics. And stress can affect the way individual genes work. And some of stress-related changes that we see, and we'll talk about, can be inherited. And this is what is referred as epigenetic memory.
Thank you, Dr. Mack. I'm so glad you began with genetics, because it certainly makes it easier to understand how we move from genetics to epigenetics.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And yes, and I think it's a journey that many people in this country may not have considered. So it's important, I believe, for that explanation that you gave. Mrs. Argent Tariq, somewhere along the continuum that you exposed us to on that long journey from Africa to this country, you talked about the dehumanization of African Americans. And I'm wondering how that dehumanization moved from individuals to communities, or perhaps they've always been a part of one another, but we just haven't considered it. So would you say something about how the movement from the individual to the community occurred in both Black and white people?
Sure. So the training to create a slave was continuous, and all things African were considered inferior. The music was considered savage. The standard of beauty was Eurocentric. The languages were said to be grunts and likened to animal sounds. The religions from Africa and all customs were primitive. Family and love relationships were constantly at risk. If any rule on the plantation was broken, they could be beaten or sold away. The plantation was an excellent environment to foster white supremacy and Black inferiority. Whites are omnipotent and Blacks are born to be subservient. Christianity was used to drive this home. And emancipation did not end this. I want to cite 3 cases of lynching where an individual is lynched, but a community suffers. In May 1918, Mary Turner protested the lynching death of her husband, who was accused of killing a white farmer. A mob hung her upside down from a tree, poured gasoline on her, lit her on fire, Mrs. Turner was 8 months pregnant. So one of the mob participants performed a crude cesarean, and with her baby still attached and alive, when it tumbled out, one of them crushed its skull with his foot. The mob then riddled her body with bullets. The message sent to Black people was merely speaking out can cost a Black person their life. What was the message that was simultaneously being sent to the white mob that was there participating in or watching the murder and the torture of this woman? In 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was visiting his family in Money, Mississippi. He was accused of whistling at a white woman, Carolyn Bryant. She told her husband, and he and his brother went to the house of Emmett's uncle, kidnapped him, and held him for days while they tortured him. They finally shot him, abused his body, and threw him in the river. The boy, his family, and the community were taught a lesson by this act of terrorism. The white woman must not be offended, and her man is powerful enough to take your child from your home and kill him. In 2017, Carolyn Bryant recanted her story of having been verbally assaulted by Emmett Till. What lesson was taught to the white community by understanding what happened to Emmett Till? In May 2020, George Floyd was accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. It was deemed a death penalty offense. The image of the police officer with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck and his hands in his pocket sent a message to the world. That message was, I am fearless, I am all powerful. This is not a human being. As Mr. Floyd laid dying and calling for his mother, the world was traumatized by the actions of that police officer. That is how an individual is used to control and enforce the dehumanization of a people.
Thank you for that. And you know, while you were talking, I could not help but remember the little girl that was there, the 9-year-old watching Mr. Floyd. And I was thinking back about how Black children in the days of lynching by a rope were made to walk by those bodies, and how white children were taken with their parents to see those lynchings. And I just was sitting here wondering what the psyche of those children is, having to watch all of that that's happening, because it's hard enough for adults to watch it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
I appreciate your explanation. It's a lot to digest, and it will probably take some time to think through. Dr. Mack, I want to turn back to you now. Recently, a young friend who grew up with my daughter, as a matter of fact, lived next door to us here in New York, Dr. Allison Bryan Mantha, was appointed Senior Medical Director for Health Equity at Massachusetts General in Brigham. In her new position, she's charged with leading clinical health equity efforts across that medical system. The goal is to eliminate structural racism in medicine and discover whether or not implicit bias is embedded in the structural and cultural dynamics of Massachusetts General. Considering what they're doing, I wonder if you would say a word or two on whether or not racism itself could be making African Americans sick.
Okay, all right. I'm still trying to get through those 3 lynching episodes in this, Tariq. But that's trauma. And we have trauma and chronic stress. And I want to explain that stress is this physiological demand that's placed on our body when we have to adapt, cope, or adjust. And cortisol is a stress hormone that can be used in acute or chronic situations. When it's used acutely, it's beneficial. And we see that in a fight or flight situation where your body knows you're somewhere and you've got to either run or you've got to fight. Your body is not going to take time to digest food. It's getting everything prepared for you to run or to have battle. That's a good situation. That's an acute situation. But if stress is persistent, this can lead to chronic exposure to cortisol. And that's the stress hormone, or one of them. And chronic exposure to cortisol can cause changes in gene expression. It can result in increased blood pressure, weight gain, and diabetes. And the trauma of humiliation caused by racism, it creates recurrent stress. And this recurrent stress can be seen in individuals, families, and communities. And this recurrent stress can be inherited and transcend generations. So I want to just tell you a little bit more about cortisol and the question of is racism making us sick? Again, chronic stress exposure from discrimination, from poverty, it may lead to increased or excessive amounts of cortisol. And this excessive cortisol can damage our body over time. And this damage to the body can now be measured using health data. And the health data that they can use is cholesterol, blood pressure, and a cortisol level. And they assign numbers to each. And the higher numbers or the higher scores, they're linked to lower life expectancy and a higher rate of chronic disease. Of note, though, is that African immigrants, they have a lower score than African Americans that were born in the United States. But the longer the African immigrant lives in the United States, their scores increase. And it is not due to poverty, because at all income levels, African Americans have these high scores.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to take in. I'm going to switch slightly here to something that friends of mine in Connecticut recently sent me. And it was notification of the State House passage of a bill that declares racism a public health crisis in Connecticut. And looking at Connecticut, understanding that what they are seeking to explore more deeply is the effect racism has on public health in that state. So it seems that a number of places are looking into the effect that racism has on the health of people of color, just as you have pointed out, Dr. Matt. I'm going to ask you if you, well, actually, when we look at implicit bias within the healthcare system, a number of African Americans have said that often when they feel there's something wrong with their bodies, they go to a doctor, they describe what they are experiencing, and the doctor will either examine them and talk down to them, or will examine them and tell them to go home and come back if the problem still exists. So I wonder if you would share with us some of the healthcare disparities that you may have seen among African Americans compared with other patients.
Yes, excuse me. I'm sorry. So I wanted to really explain what implicit bias is. And it really refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions, and they're unconscious. And implicit bias is influenced by culture, media, our upbringing. All of these give us some unconscious attitudes. And so examples of implicit bias is you can look at pain. Early on in the 19th century, we had Dr. Sims, who is known as the father of gynecology, and he did countless operations on enslaved women. And he didn't give them any pain medication because he felt and thought that Black women didn't experience pain. And so several writings have shown that he has done this. And so that was his perception. That was how he was brought up. And this could be an example of implicit bias. More recently, though, Dr. Susan Moore, a Minnesota physician, died from COVID, but she was in a lot of pain because the COVID had affected her lungs. And she was asking for pain medicines and they wouldn't give it to her. And they told her she was drug seeking, even though they knew she was a physician. And she was one who would champion her patients so that they wouldn't go through what she went through. Another example of implicit bias is Blacks are perceived to be very passionate, to be less passionate about their health than whites. And we're more likely to just be thought of that we are seeking for, any Black person comes, you're seeking for a handout. And so that is not the case. But if that's what you've been brought up, any Black woman or any Black person that you see, you're going to think negative thoughts. Even though you may say some of my best friends are Black, it's an unconscious attitude that you have. And then Blacks are really less likely to be prescribed medicines in their treatments. For example, heart interventions. There was a study in Boston which showed that Blacks were sent to the regular medical floor if you had heart problems, and whites were sent to the ICU for any type of invention. And Black males are less likely to receive chemotherapy or radiation for their prostate cancer, and more likely to have to say that their testicles should be removed in treatment of prostate cancer. So perceived discrimination, whether it's in the workplace, you have gender, race, and ethnicity, these perceived discriminations are a key factor in chronic stress-related health disparities among African Americans. And policies that we have in this country, they do perpetuate institutional and cultural racism. For example, housing, access to care. If you're in a Medicaid, a non-Medicaid expansion state, these are all things that can perpetuate structural racism. So what are some of healthcare disparities among African Americans that I really wanted us to think about? African Americans are at a higher risk for heart disease, stroke, cancer, asthma, influenza, pneumonia, diabetes, and HIV. And diabetes is common in 10% of African Americans ages 35 to 49, compared to that same age group of 6% of whites. African Americans are 20% more likely to have a psychological distress, but we're 50% less likely to receive counseling or mental health treatment. African Americans have kidney failure that's approximately 3 times that of whites. And African Americans are experiencing more severe illness and death from COVID-19 compared to whites, as we saw with the Minnesota physician, Dr. Susan Moore. So is racism a public health crisis? Yes, it is. In 22 states in the United States, they have declared racism as a public health crisis. This is a fundamental racism, that is, a cause of adverse health outcomes and inequities in African Americans. And these domains of racism, structural, institutional, cultural, individual, they're linked to our mental and physical health outcomes. And racism contributes to heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and even mother and infant mortality. The health disparities that are associated with environmental stress include some of the same: childhood asthma, high blood pressure, substance abuse, diabetes, and obesity. So you asked, is racism making us sick? I say yes. And 2 prominent African American physicians, Dr. David Williams and Dr. Kamara Jones, have made it their lifetime work to talk about racism and making us sick.
Thank you so much for that. You know, as you were speaking, I was remembering friends who also had reported not getting the kind of medication they needed for the pain that they have. I'm glad you talked about unconscious bias within that, because these same friends have said that they had moved from white doctors to doctors of color, not necessarily African American doctors, but all doctors, a number of doctors of color, and that they find themselves now getting the kind of medication they need to control their pain. And so I'm glad you made a point of saying that this is unconscious bias. But it also seems that doctors of color are making more inroads in terms of dealing with patients of color who are suffering from some of this unconscious bias that has been going on. Thank
And
you.
I think it's because we can relate to the patient. When you develop that relationship with a patient, they're looking at you and they're trying to see if you understand them. And so it really just takes listening. And it doesn't mean that every patient I see, we have the same beliefs, but I'm listening and I'm listening to them and they're listening to me, and it's a dialogue. And that's what we have to really do to counteract implicit bias. Not every physician do you need to be of color, but every physician, regardless of your color, needs to be aware that of implicit bias and act accordingly. And it's basically listening and respecting the patients.
Thank you so much for that last point, and for making the point that it doesn't necessarily have to be doctors of color, but it has to be someone who's really listening and who is empathetic. Mrs. Arjat Tariq, I want to ask you how perceptions have changed based on a patient, and based on who the patient is, and especially with regards to things like opioids.
Okay, thank you. I'm thinking to my work at St. Mary's Center. So many of the patients at St. Mary's have histories of addiction, which include heroin. And I'm thinking about how many of them spent many years in prison because of their addiction, having a quantity of heroin on them or some pills on them and being arrested and sentenced. I look now at a different environment for people addicted to opioids. And it is certainly skyrocketing in this country. I think many of us know what perpetuated the rapid growth in opioid addiction. But I have to say that the face of opioid addiction is lacking in melanin. The face of opioid addiction now is a white person who deserves treatment and who deserves the best treatment available. And there are commercials that I've seen on television from addiction centers which talk about how patients need to be treated with compassion and empathy and to be cared about. This is a far cry from how Black addicts have been treated. And it was incarceration and the attitude of even some professionals was that they were morally deficient. And what I ask is that we all start to be critical thinkers about what we're being fed and why we're being fed that. We need to look at addiction as a disease. It is a disease. When you speak to people who have become addicted to whatever, alcohol, pills, or whatever, they are living often with tremendous guilt. They have remorse. They are depressed. They may, as Dr. Mack mentioned earlier about mental health issues, often people self-medicate because they have mental health issues.
Mhm.
And they get something from a friend or a buddy that will temporarily make them feel better, then they're off to the races, so to speak. But until we start to become honest about the way we look at any area where there could be implicit bias, discrimination, or disparate treatment of fellow human beings based on this color, we are going to end up doing the same things and expecting different results, which I think we know that that's a sign of insanity.
Mhm.
Mm. Thank you. And I think the point that both of you make has been well taken, that what it takes for doctors of any color is a sense of empathy and an ability to listen to their patients and to respond on a human level to what they are hearing. This has been incredibly enlightening and educational in terms of the conversation that we've had with both of you tonight. And I think it's been a tremendous help to the Episcopal Diocese of New York as we consider reparations for systemic racism and medical apartheid. There is something called post-traumatic slave syndrome, which Dr. Joy DeGruy speaks of. And that, I think, has been laid open tonight by both of you for us to continue to examine. And so we're grateful to you for helping us explore the iniquities that exist in the healthcare system and making us aware of them and possibly how we can be our own best advocates. We encourage those of you who have tuned in tonight and who may have recommendations as to how we continue to seek ways of making reparations for medical inequities, to send your suggestions to Nell at nellbraxtongibson.com. You'll find that information in the chat box. You will also be able to find additional resources, some of which have been referred to tonight. We have been very fortunate in the Diocese of New York to have a bishop who supports the work of the Reparations Committee and who has been active in joining other faith leaders in a call for the New York State Legislature to pass the New York Health Act. Those of you in New York can add your support by going to a link in the chat box that you will find tonight. And in light of Bishop Dietschy's stand, we invite you now to watch this 2-minute video excerpt.
I want to acknowledge the high cost in human life which COVID-19 has demanded of us. Half or more of our parishes have had parishioners contract the disease, and of those, a not insignificant number have lost people to the pandemic. Everywhere we are in grief, and our prayers are filled with the names of those who have passed beyond our sight this year. In some cases, those losses have happened in high numbers. I think we all know the numbers that have come from St. Luke's in the Bronx, where at least 15 people have died of COVID. 15 people who just months ago were in the pews on Sunday, laughing with their friends and saying their prayers, who were living real lives and had real futures in front of them and who have been lost to us in the blink of an eye. Just as we have seen in the wider world, the ravages of COVID have landed more heavily on people of color, especially people of African descent, than on white people. In that the roots of that disparity lie in unequal access to health care and in the consequences of poverty, we can see that it becomes another cost of racism in America, and perhaps the highest cost of all, that Black people must now die in greater numbers when the virus comes. And that outrageous fact alone cries out for reparation of America's healthcare system, but far more than that, for reparation of a structure of wealth and poverty which consigns people of color to the poorest caste levels in America and has locked so many African Americans out of ordinary wealth creation now and always since the days of slavery.
Thank you so very much to our moderator, Mrs. Gibson, and to our panelists, Dr. Teresa Mack and Ms. Holly Argent Tariq, for a critical, compelling, and thought-provoking presentation. If we are to change our church and our country, we must engage in some extremely hard work. As African Americans, we must continue the difficult work that we have been doing for many years and for many generations. As white people, we must continue to aggressively engage in the exceedingly difficult work of learning the history, all of our histories, admitting our history, and actively making the decision that we are going to work towards becoming a different people. As African Americans and other people of color, we must continue the work that we have already begun. This will not be easy. It is terribly difficult work. We see many examples of that difficulty daily. A country that is working to deny the truth outlined in the 1619 Project, an institution that is willing to deny tenure to the person who reported on that project and those truths. We must actively call on the people in power to hold the keys that pry open the doors of change and to become leaders of change. My thanks again for your attendance and attention this evening. We hope that you will join us in the next Reparations Committee panel scheduled for June 22nd at 7 p.m. The topic of our third panel is Voices Heard, Reaching for a Better Tomorrow, the work of Hudson Link, working for higher education in prison. Thank you again and good night.
Good night.